Welcome once again to When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world, with me, Liam Halligan. Now, with the US and Iran close to conflict, global oil prices are near a 7-month high. Iran's one of the world's top 10 producers, often pumping over 4 million barrels per day, around 5% of global production. But what of Britain's North Sea oil production? Well, the UK oil output's in long-term decline, of course, but in recent years has gone into free fall. This has been at least partly driven by the net zero policies of successive Tory and Labour governments. In the late 1980s, Britain produced 2.7 million barrels of oil per day, over 3% of global production. By 2023, output had plunged to just 650,000 barrels per day, falling sharply again in 2024 to 570,000, a 50-year low. In 2025, the Labour government banned the drilling of new North Sea wells, with the industry predicting a staggering 40% drop this year in UK North Sea investment. A big reason for this decline is tax. Tory then Labour net zero policies mean oil producers pay no less than 78% tax on their profits, with that Energy Profits Levy, or EPL, due to stay in place until 2030. But plunging production means actual tax revenues are also dropping like a stone, and Britain's oil and gas industry workforce, over 400,000 10 years ago, is now barely a quarter of that. In this episode of When the Facts Change, I discuss the UK's stagnating energy production with Francis Egan, who has almost 40 years of oil industry experience and is currently CEO of Quadrilla, a company exploring the extraction of shale gas in the UK, a production process also currently banned. Thanks a lot for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe my When the Facts Change YouTube channel and Substack, and enjoy the show. Francis Egan, great to have you with us here on When the Facts Change. It strikes me that as an oil man, an oil and gas man, you're very sensitive to the debate about net zero, the debate about climate change and the resulting policy implications. Just before we get going, do you detect a change in where we are in terms of the UK government's attitude and the public's attitude?
I certainly detect a change in the public's attitude. I think they're becoming increasingly aware of the cost, particularly the cost to them, of this monomaniacal pursuit of net zero. I don't detect a lot of change in the government's attitude, certainly in the opposition party's attitude, but not a lot of change in the government's attitude. And I think that's unfortunate.
Tell us how you think the North Sea could be contributing to the UK economy now and in the future. It's often written off as a dead basin. There's no oil and gas there. As an oil man, what do you and your fellow industry players think?
Well, I think it's frankly stupid, bordering on negligence to be writing it off at the same time as we're transporting liquefied natural gas across the Atlantic from Texas. And the reason that is that technology moves on. New fields are always discovered, or existing fields have a new lease of life with new technology. And there are endless examples of basins reinventing themselves, maybe not back to the heady days of complete self-sufficiency, but certainly capable of making a significant contribution in terms of energy security and pricing, for that matter. But probably even more importantly, well-paid jobs, taxes, balance of payments, all of the above. And the people that are writing it off, I suspect, have got next to zero experience or knowledge of oil industry, geology, or production.
Francis, what could the North Sea basin be producing now? We'll come on to what's actually happening, but we've had the windfall tax introduced by the Tories, reconfirmed and extended to 2030 under Labour. When you add up all the taxation, it's 78% tax on
any surpluses made by oil and gas companies, which obviously massively impacts reinvestment, not as well as profitability and the actual incentive for investing in the first place. What could we have in the North Sea at the moment, particularly when we look over to our Norwegian friends just across the sea border, as it were?
Well, I mean, I think we went from self-sufficiency probably more than 20 years ago, and the basin has been in decline since then. So it's probably not realistic to expect it to fulfill all our energy demands. But we should be setting a reasonable target of perhaps a third of our energy demands, and incentivizing and encouraging investment to do that. And bear in mind, this is all private investment. This is not taxpayer investment that we see being lavished on wind power plants when they're not even generating. This is private investment, generating jobs, generating taxes, and we should be, I think, targeting at least a third of our oil and gas requirements from that basin. And that's before we even get near to onshore and the shale potential. And that people think that's not realistic. Look at the example of the United States, gone from, one of the largest importers of gas to being the largest exporter of gas within a couple of decades. So, with the right policy and the right incentives and the right technology, a lot can be achieved. But if you're taxing private investment at 78%, you get what you asked for, which is no investment. And that's just another way of saying the North Sea is shut up. It's shut for business, folks.
We'll come on to fracking, onshore fracking. The company that you currently head, Quadrilla, is obviously potentially a major player in that area. But I just want to stick with offshore on the North Sea for now. What's the reputation of the British government when it comes to international oil and gas businesses, international energy companies more generally? In the past, surely we've had a kind of business-friendly reputation with the UK open for business. What is this windfall tax doing to Britain's reputation as a serious place to conduct economic investment in the energy sector in particular?
Well, I think what it says is that Britain, as far as the oil and gas industry is concerned, is shut for business. It has removed any future exploration possibility. It has taxed existing production to the point where it's impossible to make a profit on your investment. And that has got to be knowingly done. I mean, the people who are doing this are not stupid. So they're doing it out of an ideological belief that oil and gas is either not required or somehow evil. And this didn't, while it's being accelerated under this government, it didn't start under this government. It started under the previous government. So this trend has been continuing for a while. Now, bear in mind that, oil and gas still is supplying, I don't know the exact number, but I reckon of primary energy demand globally, it's probably about 80% or more. There's plenty of other places to invest. The UK needs the oil industry globally a lot more than the oil industry needs the UK, believe you me.
Yeah, the figure you cite there will surprise a lot of non-specialists, but oil and gas, when you include transport, is about between 70 and 80 of our primary energy needs. Even the Climate Change Committee, which you know is a sort of government's in-house, legally empowered conscience to meet the net zero targets for 2050. Even the Climate Change Committee acknowledges that even if we hit those net zero goals by the middle of the century, still some 25% of our energy needs will be oil and gas.
And I wasn't just
So
talking about the UK. I was talking about global demand. And I think people somehow get the impression that, we're only a fraction away from producing all our energy by renewables. I mean, that could not be further from the truth. If you look at the global picture, and Chris Wright has been particularly good at this, the US energy sector, in pointing out, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's 80+% certainly will be non-renewable supply of energy. And of course, energy demand is growing virtually everywhere except in the UK, where it's declining. and declining energy demand is not a good thing.
It always surprises me, Francis, if I may say so, how little non-specialists understand about the oil and gas industry. We'll remember from the early 70s as kids the Yom Kippur War, when the price of oil quadrupled. 1973, obviously the oil price was major global news back then. Every day, the Arab oil embargo, OPEC flexing its muscles, Sheikh Yamani, and all the rest of it. And yet back then, the world used about 55 million barrels of oil a day. It's now using the thick end of 100 million barrels a day. So if oil doesn't matter, why are we using twice as much as we did in 1973? But just
because
give us an outline.
We need more energy. Yeah, you're exactly right. Because energy, people talk about energy efficiency, which is important, but we are continually inventing new forms of technology that require energy. Energy is not a sector. It's the sector that enables every other sector. You can do nothing without energy, and as energy grows, you need to be able to fuel it. And now renewables can fuel maybe some of it, but they certainly can't fuel all of it, and they definitely can't fuel all of it all of the time because they're inherently intermittent. And the mad cap dash with an arbitrary target of 2030 for electricity and is it 2050 for all energy, was clearly put in place by somebody who has absolutely no understanding of the implications of switching off energy. And you can see that in the demand reduction in the UK, which is code for industries relocating elsewhere. No heavy energy industry in its right mind would invest a cent in the UK right now when we have the highest electricity prices in the developed world. Why? How could you explain that to your shareholders? But for the government, that apparently is a price worth paying.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Just to go back slightly, Francis, if I may, you're an oil man to your fingertips. You worked with BHP Billiton for a long time. You've been involved in the energy industry around the world throughout your career. Just give new readers, if you like, just a little taste of oil and gas. It's not just about energy, is it? It's about so many other things, plastics, all kinds of modern processes. Modern life is tied up with oil and gas. Just give us a little sense of how important oil and gas is to the world, because you're right. If you listen to a lot of people on the government's front bench here in the UK, a lot of journalists, you think we're very near the point where oil and gas is going to be completely, separate from Britain's economic existence.
Yeah, people, there's the obvious primary uses of oil and gas in electricity. I mean, most people don't go beyond electricity, of course, heating and fuel for driving. But beyond that, petrochemicals, virtually everything you touch will have oil and gas in it. Your phone will have oil and gas in it. Your fertilizer couldn't be made without ammonia, which is made with gas. Food wouldn't be produced. If you were to shut down oil and gas production, if we couldn't import oil and gas into this country, civilization as we know it would virtually cease. It's in everything. Petrochemicals, plastics, medicines, fertilizers, on and on.
I know this is so basic for you, Francis, and for anyone with any knowledge at all of the oil and gas industry. So thanks for indulging me there for a moment. But the reality is that, a lot of people in the House of Commons don't acknowledge what you just said, which is axiomatically true.
Well,
that's my experience.
That is a problem.
This generation of British politicians.
Well, it is a problem. I mean, if I look at, the U.S. Secretary of State for Energy, Chris Wright, he's a graduate of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, acknowledged as the best engineering university in the world. He founded his own oil and gas service company, exceedingly successful at that. Is a deep thinker about the energy industry. Is not driven by ideology. and I don't want to get personal about this, but I compare him with any, and not just the current UK Secretary of State for Energy. Um, Let me just say you couldn't accuse any of them of being any of the above. That's for sure. Yeah. And that is important because that feeds through into our energy policy, or rather the lack of a coherent energy policy. And it's, you hear people talk and they can't even distinguish between electricity and energy. Electricity is an important part of energy, but it's not the only part of energy. You don't
All the
heat your
time.
homes with
All the
electricity.
time.
You mostly don't drive your car with electricity. But people think, oh, all we have to worry about is electricity. If we decarbonize electricity by 2030, job done. You know, it's or that the UK contributes 1% of global emissions. Yeah, I could go on. I'll try not to.
I want to come on to Chris Wright because he gave a really pulverizing talk to the IEA recently, the International Energy Agency, of course, the kind of think tank for global oil importers around the world. We'll come on to him, but I just want to stick with the Britain's oil and gas complex. You've got this industry under your fingernails every day. Tell us, this is an industry that employs, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 people up and down the country, often in good jobs where there aren't that many good jobs in certain regions, with all respect. What's happening to Britain's oil and gas industry as a result of government policy under successive governments? Tell us what's happening in Aberdeen. Tell us what's happening offshore. You got the GMB, the third biggest union in the UK, really hammering Labour about this, saying that a lot of these net zero jobs being sacrificed on the altar of net zero. It's approaching, like the miners' strike. You got the top union leaders in the country saying we're not going to allow oil and gas workers to be sacrificed like the miners were in the mid 1980s. Absolutely incendiary comparison for people within the kind of Labour movement to be throwing at each other publicly. We don't hear much about this on the mainstream media, Francis. Do tell us, what is these policies doing to industry, to jobs, to lives and livelihoods, as well as to investors?
Well, I mean, in short, the industry is being destroyed, and the people working in it are being destroyed. And this wonderful phrase, just transition, which sounds like it's been invented by a committee somewhere in Whitehall that may never have set foot on an offshore oil and gas platform. And it's supposed to mean that we can just magic up alternative, equally well-paid jobs in renewable industries to offset the loss of jobs in Aberdeen, but not just Aberdeen. A lot of people working offshore come from where I am now in Manchester. They come from Newcastle. I spent many years offshore in the North Sea, and I met people from all over, but mostly from the north of England, from former shipbuilding communities, scaffolders, welders. These aren't all Texan tycoons we're talking about here. These are ordinary, what Keir Starmer might even call working people who are having their jobs taken away. And because it's offshore, they don't either have the ability or I don't know why, probably the ability or the backing to be able to protest in the way that the coal miners did. Because if they could or should, they'd be marching on Whitehall and saying, why are you destroying our lives? Why are you destroying our families? And it's not like we don't need the product. You could argue, well, coal had been supplanted by gas, so we didn't really need coal. But we're actually importing the stuff from Texas. And we have it, offshore Aberdeen, but we're making people unemployed. And this is not a trivial matter. We're making thousands and thousands of hardworking people unemployed under a Labour government. And I'm pleased that the GMB, and I've spoken with them in the past, at least are saying something about it. But nobody in Labour seems to be listening to it. And Labour seems to have lost, certainly in its energy policy, its focus on workers. Sacrificed on the altar of ideology.
You'll know, Francis, that a lot of those guys generally, not exclusively, but generally blokes working on oil rigs, if they do a few years on an oil rig, they get well paid, they can stash money, they can buy a family home, and many, many people in their family and beyond their local communities will benefit from that single stint on an oil rig for a number of years with somebody really doing their life's work to get a little bit of money behind them and their family. Particularly families from the north of England who tend to populate these oil rigs, people from industrial jobs that have been made redundant, if you like. So tell me about Aberdeen at the moment. The Scots Nats in the past, we're going to make it the net zero capital of Europe. Is that happening? Is there green investment going in? Or as the public's mood towards net zero shifts, as, big institutions start talking differently about net zero, we can come on to, European car makers pushing back the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars to 2035 and beyond. Pretty much no deadline now as far as the European Commission are concerned. Is that green investment now stalling because of the policy uncertainty that we're seeing?
Well, I don't know that it ever could have, in the time scale being envisaged for net zero, replaced the well-paid jobs, that are not just offshore, but in the supply industries that support work offshore. Catering, shipping, supply of equipment. It probably could never have done it anyway, but to try and do it in 10 years was ridiculous. And what you're seeing in Aberdeen now is a city that's losing hope, a city that feels abandoned. And for the SNP to preside over this is disgraceful, frankly. They are gutting their major industry. When in times past, when the referendum on Scottish independence was being held, the oil and gas industry was held up as the savior for Scottish nationalism. It was the revenue stream that was going to support independent Scotland. And now, what's it being replaced with? Who knows? There are real world consequences for this obsession with hitting an arbitrary target by an arbitrary date for something that will have no impact on climate change. I'm not a climate change denier. I'm not a climate change tub thumper either. But what we do on climate change, frankly, is irrelevant to the big picture. Nobody is following our lead anymore. People are looking astounded at what we're doing. We're hollowing out our industries. But now it's moving from Aberdeen to petrochemicals, plants closing. It's already hit steel, plants closing, cement, plants closing. And the next one, as you just said, will be the motor industry. Because we've imposed these arbitrary targets for them to sell electric vehicles to people who don't want to buy them, or be fined. And they're just going to lose their market share. And these are international companies. They don't have to invest in the UK. It's exactly the same as the oil industry. International companies don't have to invest in the UK. We need them more than they need us.
So let's come on to this recent speech by Chris Wright, US Energy Secretary. You've mentioned him. He founded, Liberty, a big oil company, very knowledgeable guy. He's gone to the IEA, which is like the holy of holies, the International Energy Agency, like the think tank for big oil importers around the world. And he's told them they need to stop modeling climate change. What's going on there? How big a deal within your industry is that speech?
Well, I think the Trump administration has upended a lot of things. And I think, in the energy sphere in particular, Chris Wright, from my perspective, is a welcome voice, because he's someone who speaks with experience, a lot of experience, and he's someone who thinks deeply about the energy industry. And he's not someone who says, well, we shouldn't have any renewables, but we used to talk about the energy trilemma. We used to talk about security, affordability, and emissions. And now in this country, all we talk about is emissions. And we've lost sight of security, and we've certainly lost sight of affordability. And Chris is coming at it from probably putting them in a reverse order: security, affordability, emissions. And we've got emissions, emissions, and emissions. No, it's pretty simple.
Francis, give us your vision for what the UK energy complex could look like if the government was to relax the ban on fracking, onshore fracking. This is a activity which the company you head up, Quadrilla, is well placed to be part of. You've got a lot of expertise. So give us your perspective on that.
Well, Quadrilla and myself personally have invested lots of time and a good deal of money in demonstrating that the UK has got a very significant shale gas resource. Now, for non-oil and gas industry people, what a resource means is essentially there's a lot of gas in the ground, but we don't know yet how much we can get out of the ground economically. And that's the key point. If you have to be able to get it out at a price that makes sense for those producing it, and at a price that makes sense for the consumer. But experience has shown in the US, and now China is following their lead, that if you have a resource and you have supportive policies, the technology already exists. We're not trying to invent something new here, to extract that at a price that will lower bills and encourage industry to develop. And energy intensive industries, not just the historic ones like cement and steel and petrochemicals, all of which we still need, but the emerging ones like artificial intelligence, will relocate wherever energy is cheapest. And if we want to attract and maintain those industries, we need to be focused on that. Security, affordability, emissions. That's I would, go back to that mantra. We have imposed restrictive policies, particularly on shale, to prevent us developing it. The regulations have been frankly ludicrous, and that was deliberate. We fought against it. I fought against it for a long time, but you push a boulder uphill as far as you can. If someone is pushing it back down against you, your investors are going to say, well, why? So I think the boat has not sailed on it because the shale resource is still there. It's not gone away. But there would need to be a very fundamental, one, policy rethink, and two, reaching out to potential investors to say, we've changed.
And what do you say to those who raise safety concerns, earth tremors? A lot of people have seen documentaries with, domestic taps going up in flames and so on. Are they scare stories? Is there any accuracy in them? How can you guarantee that if you were allowed to frack onshore in the UK, that safety measures would be uppermost in your mind?
Well, I mean, that has always been the case, frankly. That there's never been taps going up in flames. Those scare stories have been well and truly, demolished. I don't know how many taps in the US have got up in flames. The seismicity, the reason that we were shut down in Lancashire, is entirely manageable. The levels that were recorded at were equivalent. The ground vibrations were equivalent to any construction site. Now, if you were to shut down every construction site in the country on that basis, then you wouldn't build any houses here anymore. So I think the safety side of it is entirely manageable. It needs to be managed, and a country that developed North Sea oil and satisfied all its domestic demand from that source is certainly capable of doing that. It all comes back to political will, policy, and everything flows from that. From that, you can attract investment. With investment, you can attract good people. good technologies. You can support a reasonable regulation system designed to make the industry work safely, not designed to shut down the industry.
Have you had interaction with Britain's Labour government, Francis? If so, how has that been? And also, what do you think about the opposition parties? What are reforms policies in your sector saying to you? What are the Tories' policies in your sector saying to you?
These days I have had very little involvement with the government, and I don't think you or your listeners would find that surprising. Um, I I have had some involvement with reform and very little involvement with the Conservatives. The Conservative Party appear to be changing their tune, but slowly. And I would remind you and others that the moratorium on fracking was not introduced by Labour. It was introduced by Boris Johnson, the Conservative Prime Minister, and was reintroduced by Rishi Sunak, a Conservative Prime Minister. The Climate Change Act was not introduced by Labour. It was introduced by Theresa May, a Conservative Prime Minister, and supported by I think went through the House of Commons without a vote, or supported by everybody in the House of Commons. So the track record of the Conservative Party, frankly, would make me, and I'm sure would make many investors, nervous.
And do you think Reform have got a better idea? How do you envisage a Reform government making changes that could reinvigorate Britain's energy sector? Do you believe what they say?
I believe that they have an awareness greater than any other party of the issues that are being faced, and perhaps more importantly, they have a desire to change it. Now that's a fundamental starting point. A necessary but not sufficient condition, as mathematicians would say. But in the people that are there, and Richard Tice, who has been appointed as the business energy lead for reform, I think they have someone who has the capacity to make the policy changes that are required, but it's going to be a hard road. Not just in energy, of course. There are lots of other areas that I'm not an expert in, but we can see that need addressing in the country.
And finally, Francis, where will the UK's energy sector be if we continue down the same path with these Conservative originated, Labour reinforced policies? Where will we be in terms of our oil and gas sector? Where will we be with our energy sector in general? Where will we be with our national grid? Because credible people of great knowledge and scientific expertise now are raising the spectre of what the Yanks would call outages, of blackouts, of the grid being unable to cope, not least, as you've intimated, as the demands on the grid rise very, very rapidly with the advent of artificial intelligence and data centers more generally.
Yeah, well, I think we are in effect already having blackouts. We've protected the domestic industry from those, but industry has voted with their feet and they've offshored most of their business, which is the equivalent, which is why you're seeing energy demand decreasing. Energy demand decreasing is the equivalent of a blackout. It's just not well understood as that. In any thriving economy, you will find energy increasing, because energy is what drives the economy. Everything in the economy is driven by energy. You can't do virtually anything without energy. And if your energy demand is declining, you've got an economy that's in trouble. And now you're an economist, Liam. You look across any growing economy, you'll see growing energy demand. You look at the UK economy, I don't know, for at least the last 10, maybe 20 years, our energy demand, our electricity demand has been declining. Now that's because industry has departed and prices are too high and domestic consumers are self-rationing. back to your question, there won't be an oil and gas industry in this country, but we'll still need oil and gas. So we will be importing it. It will cost us more. It will be less secure, and it will have higher emissions. And when our gas-fired power stations and our nuclear power stations begin to shut down, and we've kept them going a lot longer than their design lives, in both cases, and after 2030 they will be shutting down, we are going to have huge problems.
And Francis, you've got a way with words. Let's imagine that a miracle happens and you are allowed into a Whitehall ministry, and you get in a lift and it's you and Ed Miliband, and you've got 10 seconds with him. What'd you say?
I'd say security, affordability, emissions. Remember the first two, Ed.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Francis Egan, on When the Facts Change. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Liam.
Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, Economics and Politics in a Fast-Moving World with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify or the podcast app. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack.